the same page is our monthly, actually bi-monthly book club that the library sponsors. And this month, March, the book of the month is The Samurai's Garden by Gail Tsukiyama. How many of you have read this book? Excellent. That's fabulous. And Gail is blushing in front of me. Excellent. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Gail. Gail Tsukiyama was born and raised in San Francisco. Her combined ancestry, a Chinese mother from Hong Kong and a Japanese father from Hawaii, has given her a unique perspective on these two cultures. She is the author of many books. Besides The Samurai's Garden, she wrote Women of the Silk, The Language of Threads, Dreaming Water, and others. So please help me welcome Gail Tsukiyama.
There you go. So that means if you've read the book, you won't be buying the book? I always feel a little bit embarrassed because I looked back and I kept thinking, this book was published in 1993. Who's going to want to hear about it now? That's the first thing I was thinking. And yet I feel so honored that we call it, those in the know, who good friends of mine call it, the Energizer Bunny. It's the book that somehow has kept going all these years. And I will tell you up front that it was the book that I thought at one time that maybe they wouldn't publish. My very first book was Women of the Silk. And I knew that I was writing about something that was a little bit different because I didn't even know about these women of the silk. And so I wanted to write something telling their story. Well, the second book is the tough book for us writers. I mean, you hear that a lot where the publishers are kind of wondering if an author has the second book. Because everybody, I feel, even here, sitting here, all of you have one book in you. Whether it's a family story, whether it's your story, whether it's ancestors, whether it's your history or a history that you want to write about. But it's the second one that's hard. And I felt that greatly when I sat down and turned on the computer and thought, now I have to write book number 2. And I had in mind, too, that I wanted to write something very different from Women of the Silk that was strictly about these feminist Chinese women during the turn of the century. And I wanted to write also about the other half of my culture, which was the Japanese side. So I had all these things in mind when I sat down, but I didn't have the story. And I actually didn't have the culture, unfortunately, because I was born here in San Francisco, raised in the Bay Area, half Chinese, half Japanese, but raised in the Chinese culture. So I knew everything about the Chinese culture when I sat down to write my first book, and it felt very comfortable in that way. When it was time to write the second book, and I knew that I wanted to explore a bit about my Japanese side, it was going to be more difficult in the sense that I didn't know the culture. Which meant that right away I'd have to learn a lot besides. It's something that wasn't ingrained in me besides just the story. I sat down and I thought of this story that my mother had always told me about her brother being ill, and that at one point he had to go from Hong Kong to Japan to recuperate. And I heard it a lot, and he wanted to be a painter, and he was the only, at that time, the one who was from his generation who wanted to be an artist and wanted to go to Paris and wanted to paint. And I always thought about that, because it must have been so hard for him to be growing up in Hong Kong, wanted to do that, to be so far away from everything and have this dream, and then to get sick at this point. So hearing that, I thought, now, is there a story here? And that's the way it begins for writers. People think that something just jumps out and we have it all in our head and everything is there. Well, it's usually the opposite. We have nothing in our head. We turn on the machine and we're praying for something to come. With Women of the Silk, I had researched for about 6 months, and I had read and read and read. In one book, I found these 2 lines about these women silk workers. And I knew almost immediately that that's what I wanted to write about. It came to me like one of those dreams that every writer prays for, that you just knew you wanted to write about that. With the second book, it was more difficult. I sat down and I didn't know what I was going to write about for about 6 months, which was very fearful for me because of the fact that I didn't know if I had that second book. And when I thought of the story of which became Stephen's story, I started to ask myself questions, and I think a lot of writers do that, and that is usually how I begin. What did he do when he got to Tarumi? Who did he meet when he first got off the train? Who was this manservant? What was his life about? And it all began with these little seeds and these particular questions, as simple as that, although then I had to answer them. And what I had done was I don't usually work with an outline. A lot of writers do. They outline what is going to happen, and sometimes they have to because they have these huge books in which, if you're writing a mystery, for instance, you need to outline the plot. I tend to write a lot about characters. The characters drive the story for me. So when that happened, I began to sit down and say, what happens is A, he arrives in Tarumi. He gets off the train. What's going to happen? And I knew Z, he's going to get on that train and leave at the very end of the book. But I didn't know all the alphabets in between, B through whatever that was, and I was a little bit nervous, and I just took one step at a time, very Japanese-like. And I began to study and read everything I could find on the Japanese culture. And the incredible thing about, I think, writing The Samurai's Garden was not having everything that went into it, and it still became a very quiet book, because there is a tsunami, there's TB, there's leprosy, there's a fire, there's, all of this is in there, and yet I always call it my Zen book. It's the most meditative in a lot of ways, and I think it's because as I was learning more about the Japanese culture, all of that started to go into the book, and it gave me the structure of what the book was going to become, which was very much taking after what a Japanese garden is. Very early on, I started reading about gardens, and this is how you don't know where you're going. You just start reading. And because Japanese gardens are such a huge aspect of the culture, I just started reading on gardens. And I love the idea of the nature of it. And I love the idea of how they use the gardens and how much it means to them. So I just started reading. And then I read one line, and this was kind of like the silk worker line, where it kind of just embraced me, and I thought, that's it. That's what I'm going to write about. There was a line where it said that you never walk from the front gate to the front door in a straight line. It's always a curving path in which you discover things along the way. So I said, well, that's it. He lands, he gets off the train in Tarumi, and very slowly he would walk down this path, and he would discover the story of this caretaker, Matsu, along the way. And then it began to move. But, when I speak of it, it seems like it's so simple, but it wasn't simple. This is months of thinking about things, and this is times of writing things down and thinking it doesn't work. And I'm incredibly fortunate that I have a writers group that I have written with and shown my work to for we were trying to figure it out on the way over. I brought some of my audience with me. See, this is what you do when you're a writer. You never know who's going to come and listen to a book that's written in 1995. So you bring some audience with you. And we're in the car and we're thinking, when did we get together? And of course, then that brought us back to how old are we? We can't be that old, is what I keep saying. But we've been together kind of pushing 20 years, is it? Something like that. Well, they've seen things from the very beginning of my career, and they have told me things in which I could just kill them for. But down the line, now it's like water off my back. Not that I don't listen. They're back there going, yeah. Not that I don't listen, but the difference is everything they tell me I know is for my own good now. Like a member of your family, like your mother would tell you, or your brother, or somebody who loves you a lot tells you. And so you may not like it, but you understand it now, and you take it. And I apply so much of these books are their books because of that. Even now when I'm writing, and they're always getting on me because sometimes they don't see the entire book all the way through, poor ones, because I'm rushing to, get the manuscript in. But they are so there because as I'm writing, and I turn on the computer, they're all like sitting on my shoulders. I can hear them say, don't do that. Or if you do that, you're going to be in big trouble when you bring it to the group. So it's the learning process, and they've done that with me for every book. And I know when I brought them Women of the Silk, they were so good in helping with that one. And when I brought Samurai's Garden, I didn't know what they were going to think. I thought, they're going to think, what is she doing? She's writing this quiet book about this Japanese seaside village, and a young man who has TB, and he meets the manservant, the caretaker of the house, and the woman has leprosy, but they loved it. And I thought, okay, it doesn't matter, no matter if my editor, who doesn't get to see it until it's finished, but these women do. Even if she said, put it in your drawer, and take it out when you're 80, which is right around the corner according to my calculations, then it would be fine, because they wouldn't say they liked it if they didn't like it, kind of thing. So I felt comfortable to keep going. And I'm not just saying this because they're in the audience. I'm saying it because when I see them, I think of all these things going back. And I don't say this at every time Samurai's Garden comes up and I speak of it. I'm saying it because it brings up memories, even though it's 1990, whatever, that it was, and it brings back writing process memories that's very helpful to me now, even as a writer. And if I didn't have them, I don't know what I would do, kind of thing. But with Samurai's Garden, I remember that I brought it, and I think they never know what to expect from me. And actually, one of them said to me today, well, you never write the same story. And I always feel like I am writing the same story. In all the books that I've written, for some reason, because there are themes that go through my books that I find that even though consciously I don't sit down and I say, I'm going to write about beauty, or I'm going to write about family, and I'm going to write about World War II, God forbid. Well, it somehow goes through every single book I've done, even when I've tried not to. So, there's things you can't run away from. Well, Samurai's Garden probably is the example of quintessential set right before World War II, got both of my cultures in it, got everything that I wanted to do, and taught me what it meant to be Japanese to a large extent. And that's taking liberties saying taught me what to be Japanese, because of course I can't know exactly what it means to be Japanese, but it gave me a lot of the culture. A culture that I realize now, in learning more about it, that I was a lot Japanese. Even though I hadn't grown up in it, even though I was American as apple pie in so many ways, that I started to learn more about the culture, and I thought, I'm more Japanese than Chinese in many ways. And I think that this book gave that to me. So that was the greatest gift of the Samurai's Garden. That and the fact that somehow people kept reading it. And it was the book that I was worried about, and I had sent it in to my editor, and she had called. I'm telling you all the gossip stuff now, because I think that in a way is the more interesting thing. And I was nervous, very nervous, because I didn't know how she was going to receive this particular book. And she called on the phone, and she said to me, well, it's very different. And then nobody said anything. I didn't say anything, and she didn't say anything, because I didn't know what to say. I didn't know, different good or different bad. So, just be quiet. That's what you do. And a beat had gone by, and then she said, and I think this about part of and then she went on to talk to me about storylines, so I realized, oh, they're going to publish it, right? Kind of thing. And then we went on and talked about it as we would talk about a manuscript in which would be accepted. And so I'm listening to it, and I'm going, I can't believe, in my head I'm thinking, I can't believe they're going to accept this book. And it was a crazy writing experience, because of all the books, I had written half the book, and I had half the book to write before it was due in terms of the contract. We signed contracts and they put a due date on it. And that was the only book that I felt I had to get in on time. Since then, I've never done it since. And I always tell everybody, it doesn't mean a thing. Well, in my second book, I thought you had to get the book in right when they say you have to get the book in. Well, you should. I shouldn't say this to all you aspiring writers and writers out there. But I had a month and a half to write this half of a book. And the first half of the book took maybe a year and a half. I was teaching simultaneously, I was writing on the weekends, and I was trying to write as fast as I can, but I was also researching at the same time. I was trying to learn the culture and understand it enough so that it would just be part of the book. So what I did was I rented a place in Lake Tahoe, and I sat there for the entire month of August, because it was due September 9th or something, and I had summer break from teaching, and so I just sat down from the time it was morning to the time it was cocktail hour. And I always say this because cocktail hour got earlier every day. Because it was so hard to write this book when I had to write it within a certain period of time like that. And what I had done finally was, in the end, when it's done, I thought it was the perfect situation. I had to be in that situation to write this particular book because that was the situation the character Stephen was in. He was in a place he didn't want to be. He was far away from people he wanted to be close to. He was not, in his territory. And that's the way I kind of felt that month of writing by myself, farther away from home, not wanting to really do it every day from the time I got up to the time I got drunk. But I did, and the second half was written all in a month. And it worked for this book. I can't say it might work for any other book. It probably wouldn't work for any other book. When I began this book, I started it in third person. And I thought, for sure, it's a young man. I can't be a young man's voice in first person. So I wrote it in third person. I was about 5 pages in, and I said, this doesn't sound right. This doesn't read right. Something is wrong here. And I went back because I learned from my first book that you have to think about voice. You have to think about whose voice and where it's coming from. And I went back and I put it in first person. And I realized it started to work. And then what I did was I put it in these journal entries. And then it became what I should have known from the beginning, because I actually began my college career as a film major, wanting to make films and not knowing that actually I wanted to tell stories on the page and not on the screen. But what I did was I stepped back, and this is something one of my group members always tells me, where's the camera? What's happening? See from the camera's angle. And I realized that he was too far away from everything, that this book was different from the first book, because in the first book I had many voices. And in the second book, it had to be intimate. And it had to be, really, everything had to be seen from his point of view, from Stephen's point of view. And so when I began to narrow it down, the story began to tell itself. So you'll see that the process of a writer is what Elizabeth McGracken, another writer whose work I love, has always said: you cannot be afraid to make mistakes. And that is the writing process. We make a lot of mistakes. I am constantly rewriting. I am constantly looking at something and saying, I could say it with less words. That's the poetry background. I could look at something and say, oh, Blair would kill me if I did this, and then I would change it. But it's all these things. So it's a constant process. And so no book just falls onto the page, and the words don't just fall on the page. Well, they may fall on the page, but then you delete about half of them, and you start over, and you take that line, the one line that does work, and you start writing around it. And so that's basically a lot of the way I write. I want to read you some, and I guess I should start reading a little, and then I want to open it up to questions about this book or the other books, or what I'm doing now or what I'm not doing now. But basically, for me, I think that Sunrise Garden, another reason why I love this particular book, and everybody always says, what's your favorite book? And I always think they're kind of like kids. You wouldn't say, well, Johnny's my favorite son. I think we all write books at a time that we need to write that particular book. And it's hard sometimes to be an author because you have an audience who reads you and they all want you to write particular books. And that's when it gets very difficult, because if you don't write the book that they think that you might want to write, or they want you to write, then it's something else. So all the books are different in that way, but because Sunrise Garden gave me the Japanese culture, and because I think to a large extent, Sunrise Garden taught me how to write. It taught me how to write in a way that I don't think I knew as well when I wrote Women of the Silk. And I think it's processes like that is how I judge each book. Not so much this, is that my best book? Is that the best story? But it's a lot of it has to do with what did I learn from writing that book. I have a good friend who is a writer who spent 3 years trying to finish a novel, and had sent me an email. Isn't that nice to say, sent me an email? I think that when I first started writing, we didn't have email. That's scary to think now, because now I get, you get an email from a friend who said, I'm done, right? And then 2 days later, you get another email, and it says, I'm trashing it. And I thought, oh my God, how can you write a book for 2 years and then trash it? You know, and she said, I've put it in a thing, I've boxed, and I've tied it with a string, and I've put it in the closet. You know, and that's probably the last I'll ever see of it. And then I was thinking, until she's gone and somebody digs it out and sells it for $1 million. And she says, and you know, of course, then you're in the situation of you don't know really what to say, because we've all felt that way. There's always a time in the writing process where you're saying, this is not good, or not good enough, or I could just get rid of this now, or you're done and you're thinking it doesn't quite work. You know, and what am I not doing right? And can I salvage it, or can I not? Or maybe this is just a writing exercise that took 5 years. You know, so it's all these things that are going through our mind. But, you know, I wrote her and I said, and I thought a lot about this, not only for her, but for my own sake. So in a way, it was a little selfish. So I'm thinking about it, and I'm writing back to her, and I said to her, you know, thinking back on all the books I've written, you know, and thinking that, okay, not every book is the same book that you would write now if you were going to go back and do them. But why did I write that book at that time? You know, and then so I was writing her this email, and I said, you know, I think the reason sometimes that we write books is to get to the next one. You know, and maybe this book you had to write, even though nobody was going to see it, but for yourself. You know, so I thought, should I send this? Because I'm being pretty presumptuous here, saying you really had to write this book to get to the next one, which will be much better. You know, and I thought, well, you know, we're writers, we know how it is. I can send this. So what if she doesn't talk to me for about a year? She'll get over it, you know. And I sent it, and about I don't know, like within an hour, an email came back, and all there was you're right. You know, and she finished the next one, the bulk of the first draft, in 6 months. So, you know, I mean, who knows? So I felt this way with Samurai to a large extent. It wasn't easy. It was hard in a lot of ways because of the culture, because of the story, because of getting it right. But I felt that it helped me as a writer. So I'm going to swig some gin, and I'm going to read a section. And then I'm going to throw it open and see if you can ask me something that you might be interested in instead of hearing me speak. Who has read this book? Do I need to explain? No? It's you know, I had written 3/4 of the book, and I was getting tired of only seeing it from the point of view of Stephen. You know, this is another thing. Sometimes you can get bored with your own character and your own voice. And, you know, because it was coming from his point of view only, I thought, how am I going to get another voice in here? And this is the fun part of writing, because it makes you creative. And I think all arts is like this. When you get in a jam is when you think of things that you might not normally do. Well, I thought, well, now I need to get other voices in here, and how I'm going to do this. And so when Sachi, when he goes up to the village, and she's a leper lady, and when he goes up to the village and she starts telling him the story, her voice comes in. And I thought to myself, thank God, because I could write a section in her voice and not only be his voice. And, you know, and those things don't come until you actually need to work them out. And that was one of the things that stumped me for a while and then came to be, and it was when she and some of the other villagers who contract leprosy decide to kill themselves rather than to bring shame to their family and to their village, and she can't do it. And this is a section when she can't do it, and Matsu, who is the manservant whose story that Stephen slowly finds out, kind of rescues her. Even now I can feel the cold waves pushing and pulling against my legs as I stood knee-deep in the ocean that morning. There was a flock of birds flying overhead as if they had come to watch, their squawking voices leading us on. As the water lapped around me, I saw one man, the father of a school friend, walk straight into the ocean. He never turned back nor hesitated. One moment he was there, and then the next he had been swallowed by the sea. It was a nightmare. One older woman took a knife from the sleeve of her kimono, raised her hands, and slashed her wrists. I remember how the blood streamed down her arms, staining the water around her. She turned toward me and with a strange, calm smile, bowed low before handing me her knife. It felt so light and cold in my hand, I wondered how it could possibly end a life. I looked down at the sharp blade and saw my hand covered with the woman's blood. I wanted to scream, but it seemed I had suddenly lost my voice. Just as quickly, the knife slipped from my hand into the water. "Don't be frightened, child," the old woman mumbled. Find the knife and end your misery. Return honor to your family." But at that moment, I knew I didn't have the courage of Tomoko, nor of this woman dying before me. When she reached out toward me, I pushed her back, and she fell to her knees, still crying out for me to end my life, as a wave washed over her. I turned away from her and just began running. I ran and ran away from the beach and all the death and dying. Even now, I don't remember what I was thinking. The greatest honor I could have given my family was that of my death, and I ran from it. I was frightened at not only fulfilling my obligation, not giving code to my parents, yet there was a voice inside of me that kept telling me to escape. I ran away from Tarumi as if it were the diseased one. At nightfall, I hid among the trees along the stretch of road that now leads to Yamaguchi. It was so cold that first night alone, and I was so hungry. I began to think that maybe death was a better way after all. I'd never before felt the black void of abandonment, and I knew no one would be looking for me. As far as my family and the village was concerned, I had drowned with the others that morning. Everything had been planned without anyone's knowledge. We had each left notes for our families, hoping we would honor them better in the other world. I had said good night to my family for the last time, knowing that the moment I stepped out of the house that morning, I would no longer be a burden on them. The only way I could still honor them was to allow them to think I was dead. But the following morning in the woods, I was awakened by the sound of footsteps. I was so cold I had covered myself with a pile of leaves. If I moved, I would surely draw attention to where I was, so I lay silent and still, hoping whoever or whatever it was would move on. I remember staring up through the leaves to a very blue sky. It appeared so sharp and clear it seemed unreal. When I heard the steps growing closer, I closed my eyes and began praying to the gods. When I opened my eyes again, I could hear breathing and almost feel the warmth of another body. It was so close to me. Then I heard his voice call out, low and soothing, "Sachi, Sachi, it's me, Matsu. Let me help you." I thought I had died and gone into the other world. How had he ever found me? "Matsu," I whispered, springing up from the pile of leaves like a wounded animal. I forgot everything, even the shame of allowing him to see me in such a state. Matsu took one look at me and began to laugh. "Is that you?" he asked, "or is it the fox god, Inari?" It was the first time Matsu had ever joked with me. He had always been so quiet. But it wasn't the time for laughter. I was so tired and hungry. If I had been the god Inari, I might have made some food and water appear. But it was my good fortune that Matsu found me. Smiling kindly, he bowed low and helped me brush away the leaves. "I've been looking all night for you," he said. "Are there others?" I asked, my throat so dry and sore I could barely get the words out. "They think you've gone into a better world," he answered. "How did you find me?" Matsu just smiled. He opened the furoshiki he carried and took out a bottle of green tea. Even though the tea tasted cold and bitter, I have never been more grateful for anything else in my life. He also brought along some rice cakes and a package of dry seaweed, which I ate hungrily. When I finished, I bowed to Matsu and asked again, "How did you know I was here?" "Tomoko," he whispered. "What about Tomoko?" I asked, swallowing the last of the bitter tea. Matsu gathered up what little left of the food and wrapped it back up in the furoshiki. "I followed you and the others down to the beach yesterday morning. I wondered if you might try to find your way to peace, as she did." I couldn't, I began to cry, turning away in shame. Then Matsu leaned over close to my ear. He smelled of sweat and the earth as he whispered, "It takes greater courage to live." I'm going to throw it open now, I think, to questions. So you might direct me as to what you might want to know about.
Because we're taping this with SF Gov TV, we're going to ask you to ask your question into the microphone so we can pick it up.
And you too will be on TV. Now nobody will ask a question.
Okay, I'll ask a question, Gail. What are you working on now?
Oh, did that sound planted? Because it wasn't. I've just finished, I want to say a monster of a book because it's the longest book I've ever written. And again, it's set in Japan. And again, it covers the years from 1939 to 1966. And it's about two brothers. And the title is The Street of a Thousand Blossoms. And if you haven't noticed, as I was talking about themes that run through my book, one of the things I like a lot is kind of exploring subcultures. The leprosy, the silk working women. I like to write about groups of people who somehow persevere and make a life on their own aside from what the general culture is doing. And I find that I don't consciously sit down and do that, but it happens. And in this particular book, something that has always fascinated me has been sumo and sumo wrestlers, as to how they get so big and what it's like in their culture and all of that. And so one of the brothers eventually does become a sumo, and that's why it's a big book.
Do you think that being a woman who is in a, women have been oppressed. I don't know if they are now or not, but do you think that has stimulated you in your writing, coming out of that? You specifically, and also in general, do you feel like a lot of women have been stimulated by being part of an oppressed class?
Good question. Very much so. And I'll try and I'll try to answer it ABC. For me, I know that the first thing I began to think about when I thought that I wanted to write a novel-length piece was that I wanted to write about my culture. And because I had grown up in the Chinese culture, I wanted to write about China. I wanted to find out more about myself. Because I was raised in the Bay Area, because I didn't know culturally a lot of things that I wanted to know. I knew I wasn't going to write about myself, and I knew that immediately that I wasn't going to write about my family. But I wanted to write about some aspect about China and about women. And those were the two things I knew when I began the first book. And I was fortunate enough to stumble upon these silk-working women, which gave me everything I wanted to a large extent. It gave me the culture. It gave me a sense of what it meant to be a female Chinese woman during that time. And it gave me a sense of empowerment of what they had done. Regardless if they understood what they were doing at the time, they didn't know that they were a subculture that was actually earning money, that actually lived independent of husbands and family, that was actually doing everything that was against what it meant to be in the Chinese culture. And I hadn't heard about them, and I didn't know, and it was perfect. It was exactly what I was looking for. And I can go off now and start preaching about the fact that I think that so many of us Asian American authors and Asian authors in general tend to go back and write about our ancestors and tend to go back and write about things in our past, not our specific past, but maybe the past of our ancestors, our grandmothers, our mothers. We essentially, in my generation, have been telling their stories. I think the generation to come will be telling stories of living here. It'll be very different stories. But I think the oppression of our voices have been for so many, many years. I mean, if you think back, the first writer who was really read in terms of Asian American was probably Maxine Hong Kingston. And I read her in high school, and I still remember being greatly affected by reading The Woman Warrior. But before her, there were very few, very few. There were some, but they never made that huge economic splash. So they were never really read in a large way. But Maxine was the first one in the sense that we started reading her in school, so we knew of her. But she still wasn't out there the same way that Amy Tan had opened the door for us when she wrote the Joy Luck Club. So so much of it is timing. But it meant that all that history, all those voices before then had been silent. And so my generation of writers came in, and you started to hear stories of the women and the men and the families that were of a different generation. And I think a lot of us have been writing about that because they were silenced for so long. I have been involved with the Kiriyama Book Prize, and I don't know if you've ever heard that, but it's a Pacific Rim Book Prize in which books come from Asia and all over the Pacific Rim. Well, in the last 11 years that it's been a prize, we have read so many books that have come from voices of new writers that I'm always amazed. And they're writing very different stories from what I was writing when I started. So it's a good thing. It's a wonderful thing because it has opened this door where all these people have come through now. And if you look at these lists you read, Indian authors, Japanese authors, Chinese authors, and it's now we're very much diverse, which I think for such a long time we weren't. So I thank you for that question, because if I keep going, I will never get another question.
Thank you for Samurai's Garden. I read it when it first came out, and it's wonderful to be reminded.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. To jump off to a tangent, I was Samurai's Garden again, because I said it was like this Energizer bunny. Danville, the city of Danville and San Ramon had chosen the Samurai's Garden the end of last year. And again, I was thinking, oh, I've got to go talk about Samurai's Garden. Everybody has already read it. It's been out for over 10 years. What am I going to do? So they had it in the Danville Theater, which is this very nice theater. And they actually were doing Romeo and Juliet, by the way. So the balconies and all the set was set up. And then there was me right in the middle of the balcony, and I was kind of waiting for somebody. And it was a very nice audience. And when I walked in, the librarian was ecstatic, and she's going, look at, there's people here. And I'm going, and I thought, oh yeah, there's people here. And she goes, it's almost as good as last year's. And I said, who did you choose for last year? And then she told me, and she said, and the year before. And then she told me, and I said, do you realize that they're dead already? And I'm alive, and shouldn't I be pulling in a little bit more here? So anyway, to go off, thank you for coming.
Oh. My pleasure. But I just this month read your book, Dreaming Water. I'm very glad to have read it, and I'm just wondering two things. There seems to be more of an advocacy voice in terms of, yes, the internment, but the discrimination of being, an Asian American, and secondly, Warner's disease. I'm just wondering how you got into writing about that, and the characters were wonderful.
Okay, to your first question first. To be totally honest, when I sat down to write Dreaming Water, I thought to myself, this is the book that I had finished Language of Threads, and I had written 4 books that all took place in Asia. And because Language of Threads was, I hate this word, but the sequel to Women of the Silk, my first book, I felt that somehow I had come full circle, that somehow my Asia period might have been done. And it was time to move on now, and I wanted to write a book that was more contemporary, and I wanted to write a book that was set in California. And I knew that I wanted to write a mother-daughter kind of storyline, and that was what I began with. And it was the first time, as a writer, I said to myself, this character not necessarily has to be Asian. None of these characters necessarily have to be Asian. So actually, I was of mine opposite of what you're saying, happened through the book. And what happened was, the more I started to research, when I discovered Werner's, because I wanted to write, I was feeling older, physically and mentally, emotionally, just as a person. And I wanted to somehow translate that into a book. And so when I thought I was going to write about this caretaking situation, it was going to be a mother and daughter, I thought, was there an aging disease? Is there some kind of aging disease? And I know that there was progeria. So I'm kind of answering both of your questions at the same time, which is the childhood version, where children grow old very quickly. And so by the time they're 7 or 8, they look like little old people, because they age so quickly. And so the first thing I had asked myself was, is there a version of this disease for older people? In a way, does it start later in a person's life? And as I'm researching, I discover Werner's syndrome. And that's how it came to be that particular disease in the book. And so I thought, this works for me, because then she would have a life before the disease actually started to age her, which is in their early 20s, as opposed to being very, very young. But then the more I researched, the more I realized that a large population of Japanese people seem to have this genetic defect. So it kind of brought me right back to the Japanese culture, even though I wasn't looking for it to a large extent. So what happened was, if she was half Japanese, and here again, you're going to hear some of the writing process. As I'm thinking about this, as I'm thinking about storyline, as I'm thinking about her parents, if her mother is Italian and her father is the Japanese culture, which would make her half and half, and so the genetic defect would come through the father somehow, then things would have to have happened if they grew up in California. He grows up in Pasadena, which means he would have had to have been interned. You see how things start to happen without you looking at it from the beginning of sitting down and writing a story, but as you develop the characters and the year and the situation and the stories that a father would tell a daughter, all this came out. The internment camps, what happened, what he hoped for, what he wished for, all the stories that he tells the daughters. Well, some of them would have to cover that internment time, and a lot of it is what happened from my research. So all that went into the book. Does that answer your question? So in a way, it's not that I purposely sit down and say, now I'm going to advocate this. But if a storyline covers a certain aspect of history, that you tell it to the greatest truth that you can. You talk about the situation, and if you inhabit the characters, hopefully, in the right way, you try to feel what they would feel. Thank you.
We just started reading your book in my classroom a couple of weeks ago. So I think some of my students
he's lifting the book up.
Yeah, they're a little disappointed because we haven't gotten to the part you read yet, but that's okay. The story's not spoiled. I want to thank first Shannon and Alex and Bobby for coming out on a school night.
I want to thank you too.
Thanking you guys. One of the things this book has done is really open their eyes to Japan and Japanese culture, which I think is very new to a lot of them. So I'm just wondering, from your point of view, what are some of the more important aspects of Japanese culture that you'd want us to take away from reading this book? Because we're really fixated on figuring out who the samurai is. We have lots of ideas, and we're trying to deconstruct that concept of the samurai and some of the attributes of what a samurai is. We've talked about that, but in your opinion, what do you think would be useful for us to kind of think about or focus on as we finish the book? Because we're only about a third of the way through it.
One of those kind of questions. I will tell you about an email I got. I think this entire high school on the East Coast was reading The Samurai's Garden at one point, and I started to get like 30 emails. They somehow discovered through the website an email which would come directly to me. And I started to figure it out when all the questions were the same. And it was probably the questions which they had to write their essay on. But one young woman had written me, and she said, well, I don't know if I have time to read the book. Can you tell me who the samurai is and where the garden is? I thought, just when you think kids are going to be okay, this is our generation coming up. So I wrote her back and I said, read the book. I think for me, because I think every book is a learning process for me in terms of my cultures, because I am the first to admit I do not know about all that needs to be known of both being Chinese and, of course, being Japanese. I get a lot wrong. I think I cringe every time I pronounce a Japanese word because I know that I'm not saying it correctly. But, I can get away with it. I think here, I don't know if I can and maybe in Iowa I can get away with it. It's harder to get away with it in the Bay Area because we're such a melting pot. And so many people who know Japanese where I don't. But what I've discovered, I think, on the whole, and I mean for all cultures, both cultures and the writing process itself, is the more I write about different cultures, the more I realize how much alike we are. And if you take anything away, take that. Take the fact that all humanity is the same. The background, cultures are background for me. It makes you who you are, yes. If you're Japanese, you bow, right? If you're Chinese, you don't. There are certain things that are specific to each culture. But if you're writing characters, there are specific things that are everybody. And that's more important to me in that sense. You have the culture as background, but if you can understand why a person who lives in that culture feels the way they do or does what they do, I think that's the most important thing. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, thank you. You're letting me off? Do I have another story to tell you? I would if I could.
You seem very conscious of the writer's process, that you're really aware of how you work. And you mentioned that you changed from a film major to, I think, an English major, I'm not sure. Can you talk about when you sort of became conscious that you wanted to be a writer and...
You mean as opposed to a filmmaker?
Yes, and
when I fell
how that is that you're, some writers aren't as aware of their process as you seem to be, and I'm just fascinated by that. And
I would hope all writers are at least aware of the process.
Well,
Maybe I talk about it
much
more.
About it.
When I took my first film class, and it was so boring, and it had nothing to do about the story that I was watching on the screen, and everything to do about how many frames per second or per minute or whatever it was, I thought, this is not at all what I thought it would be. And then I moved to the technical aspect to a film writing course I took. And it still felt very technical because I still felt that I had to be aware of all the camera angles. Literally aware that it had to go down long shot, close up, whatever. And it felt like it was interfering with the storyline. So I actually moved over to the writing department. I graduated from San Francisco State. And it was creative writing with emphasis within the English department. And I was taking a class that's much like this. It was writers on writing, and a writer came to speak to a group of young writers. And the first writer who came was a poet. And I fell madly in love with language. And I think that's why I'm probably maybe conscious with the writing process, is because I began with the foundation of language, which is poetry for me. It made me very aware of how to use language, not to overuse language, things like that aspect of it. But I talk a lot about the writing process, I think, for a lot of reasons, because I think that if you tell what it really means to be a writer, people will think, oh, it's not as, I think to a large extent, you all think we run with the bulls, and you all think we're sitting in cafes, and I could never write in a cafe because I'd be watching people too much. How can you sit at a cafe and write novels? And yet J.K. Rowling did, so how can I do, and so we all have our process. So I think that the interesting things to talk about, a lot of it is the process of how you do it, because we all do it differently. And I don't run with the bulls, and I don't sit at cafes, but this is the way I do it, and there are many ways to do it, and you have to find your own way if you're a writer.
I went on the web last night, I Googled Harumi to try to see what it looked like, and I saw this big bridge, and it looked so industrialized. So I really was curious.
So there really is one, huh?
Yeah, I did. I was curious if it's a real place or a made place, and then how you pick the location, because I have family in Japan, and my kids are in a bilingual, bicultural program here in San Francisco that's Japanese. So I kind of want to bring back to them too.
See, I bet she speaks Japanese better than I do.
My kids might, but not me.
When I had begun, I knew that there was a Terumi. And I started, writing down things, and I thought in my mind's eye, I started writing down, I think it looks like this, and it would be like that, and I had this very small village in mind. And there was one part in time when I thought, I could go back to Japan now and actually go to Terumi and see how it looked. But I had in the book and in my heart what I thought Terumi was. I almost kind of knew that if I had gone back, it wouldn't be the same. So I made the conscious choice of not going. And now that you tell me this, I'm thankful that I didn't, because I think it would have really destroyed what I had kind of created in my head. And a lot of the times I thought, places are best when they're kind of imaginary, that you can, and that's why I hesitated actually naming it after a place where my mom said, really, what did exist? But, I started writing it, and I just kept it as Terumi. But I'm glad now that I didn't go back, because making that conscious choice, I think, would have changed, had I gone back, would have changed the direction of the book a lot.
When I saw it, it was so different than how I imagined it from reading your books.
So now, does that teach you never to look up things? Always listen to the writer. Thank you.
All right, we have time for one more question.
And it can't be your essay question. I'm just
Oh, she
teasing.
didn't give us an essay question yet. But, I just wanted to know, what made you think of the title, like The Samurai's Garden?
Oh no, the title story.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it wasn't. Okay, quickly. And this is actually a publishing business thing. I had written down really quickly on the contract, because I was reading about samurais and I was reading about gardens at the time the contract came. So I just kind of looked and I said, oh, the Samurai's Garden. Now they would just put untitled number 14, whatever. And I put down the Samurai's Garden, not thinking that that would really be the title. And what happened was, when it was time to choose a title, my editor had a god-awful title that she felt was the most brilliant title since The Grapes of Wrath, but it was like this long, and it was everything was in it but the kitchen sink. Love, samurai, garden, sushi, whatever. It felt like that. And it was a terrible title, and I didn't like it, and I didn't know what to say, because I had never disagreed from that time on. That was the first time I did disagree. And I said, I don't want to look at my bookcase, see that book, and cringe in 30 years. And she was like completely silent. And then she said, we'll discuss it when I get back to New York. She was somewhere else. She calls me from New York a week later, and she said, I don't know why we're even going over this title thing. Let's just keep it The Samurai's Garden. Well, by then I'm just going, thank you, God. And it became The Samurai's Garden, which in the end works for me, because when you decide what that samurai is in your class, you'll see how it works. But it works in many, many ways. And so I'm very pleased that it stayed The Samurai's Garden. Not of anybody's choice, but because it was kind of the one that we didn't want to fight over anymore.
Okay.
I think you wanted something else, huh? Well, I met this samurai, and thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gail, so much for coming.
Thank you.